Imagine stepping into the heart of Istanbul centuries ago. The call to prayer echoes through the city. Domes and minarets rise into the sky, and caravans bring treasures from 3 continents. This was the Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful forces the world had ever seen. When we think of this empire, we often picture the mighty sultans, the vast armies, and the breathtaking mosques that still stand today. Names like Suleiman the Magnificent dominate the history books. But here's the twist. What if I told you that the true power of the empire, the real decisions that shaped nations and determined life or death, often rested not with the Sultan himself, but with a woman hidden behind palace walls? Her title was Valide Sultan, literally the Sultan's mother. And with that title came something extraordinary: unmatched political power, immense wealth, and authority that stretched across the empire. Behind the gilded gates of Topkapi Palace, the Valide Sultan wasn't just a royal mother, she was the empire's shadow ruler. Now, think about this. In a world dominated by men, where emperors commanded armies and viziers held councils, how did a woman, confined to the imperial harem, rise to a position that made even generals and politicians bow before her? The answer lies in one of the most fascinating chapters of Ottoman history, a period historians call the Sultanate of Women. From the mid-1500s to the 1600s, the empire saw something truly unique: mothers and grandmothers of sultans taking the reins of power. These women weren't crowned in ceremonies, and they never sat upon a throne in public. Instead, they ruled through influence, strategy, and sheer political skill, shaping the destiny of millions from behind a curtain. Picture the Topkapi Palace, marble courtyards, golden domes, and behind them, the harem, a labyrinth of private chambers guarded by silence. To outsiders, it might seem like a place of luxury and seclusion, but for the Valide Sultan, it was a command center. Ambassadors sought her favor, viziers feared her word, and her decisions could shift alliances, spark wars, or end dynasties. And here's the astonishing part. This wasn't just about one woman. For nearly a century, generation after generation of Valide sultans kept hold of the empire's reins. They influenced their sons, guided their grandsons, and in some cases outright ruled when child sultans were too young to govern. They became the silent force that steadied the empire when male rulers faltered. The next time you hear about the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire, the armies, the conquests, the sultans with names etched into history, remember this: hidden behind those palace walls, veiled from the public eye, sat women who wielded power in ways most kings could only dream of. This is the story of the Valide Sultan, the mother, the strategist, the invisible queen. And in the chapters ahead, you'll discover how she became the empire's most powerful figure, ruling without ever wearing a crown. When you hear the word sultan, what comes to mind? Probably a powerful ruler seated on a golden throne, surrounded by advisors, armies, and riches. But in Ottoman history, the word sultan wasn't just for men. It was a royal title shared by women as well. And when paired with the word valide, meaning mother, it created one of the most powerful positions in the entire empire: the Valide Sultan. Now, this wasn't like the European idea of a queen mother, a figure who smiled for ceremonies but had little real influence. No, being the Valide Sultan was something far greater. She wasn't just a mother cheering from the sidelines. She was, in many ways, the empire's co-ruler, sitting at the very heart of Ottoman politics. Imagine the scale of her power for a moment. The Valide Sultan didn't just reside in the palace, she controlled it. She was the supreme authority of the imperial harem, and before you picture silk cushions and endless banquets, let's clear up a common misconception. The harem was not just a place of leisure. It was a political engine, a vast and highly organized institution where young women were trained, alliances were forged, and loyalties were tested. And at the very top of this system sat the Valide Sultan, watching, guiding, and ultimately deciding the fate of anyone who entered. But her influence didn't stop at the harem's gates. The Valide Sultan held control over the palace treasury, which meant she had direct access to the empire's wealth. Gold and silver flowed through her hands, giving her the power to fund charities, build mosques, or finance political factions. This financial control made her more than just a symbolic figure. It made her a kingmaker. On top of that, she had the ear of the most important man in the empire, her son, the Sultan himself. In a world where trust was scarce and betrayal was common, the Sultan often turned to the one person he believed had no hidden agenda, his mother. The Valide Sultan advised him on state affairs, military campaigns, and the delicate balance of internal politics. Her word could tip the scales between war and peace, between mercy and execution, and she didn't hesitate to use that influence. If a vizier, the equivalent of a prime minister, fell out of favor with her, his career was as good as over. If she supported him, he might rise to the highest office in the land. Through marriages and carefully negotiated alliances, the Valide Sultan also managed foreign relations. Imagine ambassadors from Venice, Persia, or Poland, all maneuvering for advantage, but knowing that the true key to influence lay not just with the Sultan, but with the woman behind the curtain. Think about how extraordinary this is. In 16th and 17th century Europe, royal women were often pushed into arranged marriages and told to stay silent in matters of state. But in the Ottoman Empire, the Valide Sultan was at the very center of decision-making. She turned the so-called private world of the palace into a political stage, and everyone, viziers, generals, even foreign diplomats, knew that her approval could make or break them. The most fascinating part is how she achieved this power without ever officially wearing a crown. She didn't march into battle or sit in the council chambers. Instead, she operated through networks of trust, loyalty, and strategy. Some historians compare her role to that of a chess master, moving pieces across the board while her opponents never even realized who was directing the game. So the Valide Sultan was far more than a ceremonial mother figure. She was the empire's hidden strategist, treasurer, advisor, and diplomat all in one. And she mastered a system that outsiders completely misunderstood. While Europeans whispered about the harem as a place of exotic pleasures, inside the palace it functioned as a school of power. Women were trained in etiquette, politics, and survival. And at the top of this pyramid, the Valide Sultan decided who thrived and who vanished into obscurity. This was her true genius, wielding authority from the shadows, blending the roles of mother, ruler, and political mastermind. And for nearly a century, that combination gave her a grip on the empire stronger than most men who ever sat on the throne. When we think of empires, we imagine kings, generals, and warriors, the men who wore crowns, led armies, and carved their names into history. But in the Ottoman Empire, there was a century unlike any other. Historians call it the Sultanate of Women, a period when mothers, wives, and grandmothers weren't just whispering in the shadows, they were steering the empire itself. This story begins in the mid-1500s with a woman named Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana. She was no ordinary figure. Born in what is now Ukraine, taken as a slave, she rose to become the beloved wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the longest reigning and perhaps most powerful sultan in Ottoman history. But here's the shock. Suleiman actually married her. That might sound natural to us today, but in Ottoman tradition, sultans didn't marry their consorts. Marriage risked giving a woman too much influence. Yet Suleiman broke centuries of custom, binding himself to Hurrem, and in doing so, opened the door to a new era. Hurrem wasn't just a wife. She was a strategist, a political player, and a force of will. She influenced Suleiman's policies, corresponded with foreign rulers, and secured positions for her allies. Her rise marked the dawn of women becoming central, not peripheral, to Ottoman politics. After Hurrem came a line of equally formidable women, Nurbanu Sultan, Safiye Sultan, and many others who learned that the palace walls weren't limits, they were stages. But the most legendary of them all, the name still whispered in history books, was Kösem Sultan. Kösem Sultan was extraordinary. For decades, she stood at the very heart of power, serving as Valide Sultan to her son Murad IV and later her grandson Mehmed IV. She wasn't satisfied with influence behind the curtain. She stepped into the role of regent, ruling openly when child sultans were too young to lead. Imagine this. Imperial decrees, the very laws of the empire, issued not in the name of a sultan, but signed by Kosem herself. Her grip was iron. She commanded immense wealth, personally managing the empire's finances. She controlled military salaries. Think about the power in that. Armies and janissaries marched or mutinied depending on whether their wages were paid. Kosem understood that loyalty could be bought, and she knew exactly how to spend and save to keep her throne secure. But her reign wasn't without ruthlessness. She was known to decide the fate of rival factions, sometimes ordering executions to protect her family's hold on power. It sounds brutal, and it was. But in the ruthless game of Ottoman politics, mercy could be weakness. Her survival for decades in a system where betrayal lurked at every corner is, in itself, proof of her brilliance. Now, pause for a moment and consider this. While Europe was led by monarchs like England's James III or France's Louis XVIII, here was a woman, veiled, hidden behind palace doors, exercising a level of political control they would have never tolerated from a woman in their own courts. The Sultanate of Women wasn't just a curiosity, it was a unique model of female power in a patriarchal world. But Kosem's story doesn't end the tale. Her daughter-in-law and eventual rival, Turhan Sultan, carried this legacy into the later 1600s. Turhan fought fiercely to secure power for herself and her son. And she left behind more than political maneuvers. She stamped her authority on the very skyline of Istanbul. One of her greatest achievements was overseeing the construction of the Yeni Mosque, a colossal project that still dominates the city's waterfront today. That mosque wasn't just a religious monument. It was a declaration carved in stone that a woman's influence could reshape the empire's future. The Sultanate of Women, stretching across generations, is often painted in extremes. Some saw it as the empire's golden thread of stability during weak male rulers. Others accused these women of corruption and manipulation that weakened the state. But one truth is undeniable. Without them, the Ottoman story would look very different. So let's step back and ask ourselves, how did women, confined to a harem, emerge as some of the most powerful figures in a global empire? The answer is both simple and astonishing. They mastered the system. They understood that power wasn't just about armies or crowns, it was about influence, timing, and control of resources. From Hurrem to Kosem to Turhan, these women turned motherhood into monarchy, veils into symbols of authority, and palace walls into a throne room. And while their names may not be as famous as Suleiman or Mehmed, their fingerprints are all over the empire's history, its politics, its wars, and even its cityscape. The Sultanate of Women reminds us of a powerful truth. History isn't only shaped by those who sit in the spotlight. Sometimes, the ones behind the curtain, the ones underestimated or overlooked, are the very people pulling the strings of destiny. When the Valid sultans rose to power, they didn't just sit quietly in their chambers watching history unfold. They reshaped it. Their influence reached into every corner of the empire, from the marble halls of Topkapi Palace to the bustling markets of Istanbul. First, let's talk about politics. The Valid sultans fundamentally altered the balance of power in the empire. Traditionally, grand viziers, essentially prime ministers, and military elites like the janissaries held enormous sway over the throne. But the Valide Sultan curbed that influence. She wasn't simply the sultan's mother. She was a political counterweight. Viziers who once thought of themselves as untouchable quickly learned that their careers could be ended with a single word from the harem. And here's what makes this even more fascinating. The imperial harem itself became a parallel court. To outsiders, the harem was a hidden world of silks and shadows. But in reality, ambassadors and officials knew they needed the Valide Sultan's approval as much as the sultan's. Foreign envoys slipped gifts into her hands, hoping to gain her favor. High-ranking officials bowed not just to the throne, but to the unseen authority behind it. But the story of the Valid sultans doesn't end with politics. Their influence spilled out into the social and cultural life of the empire. With immense wealth at their disposal, they became some of the greatest patrons of public works. They built mosques that still dominate the skyline, schools that educated generations, soup kitchens that fed the poor, and aqueducts that carried water into a thirsty city. Walk through Istanbul today, and you'll see their fingerprints everywhere. Monumental complexes like the Valid Sultan mosques stand as reminders that these women didn't just rule. They invested in their people, carving their names into the very stones of the city. For many citizens, their legacy wasn't whispered in political intrigue. It was felt in the bread on the table, the water in the fountains, and the roof over their heads. Of course, not everyone celebrated their power. With great influence comes great controversy. Critics accused the Valid sultans of corruption and favoritism, claiming they elevated allies, enriched themselves, and weakened the empire. Some historians argue that their rule coincided with instability, that their manipulations of palace politics pushed the empire into decline. And it's true. Intrigues within the harem sometimes spilled out into civil strife and bloody power struggles. But let's flip the question. Was their influence truly a sign of decay? Or was it a stabilizing force in a time when sultans were often too young, too inexperienced, or too distracted to govern effectively? In many cases, it was the Valid Sultan who held the empire together, guiding it through turbulent storms when male rulers faltered. So, were they corrupt manipulators or saviors who kept the empire from crumbling sooner? The answer, as always in history, depends on where you choose to look. But one thing is certain, their impact was undeniable. These women weren't footnotes. They were central figures who shaped the political and social fabric of the Ottoman world. And perhaps the real lesson is this: power doesn't always march in the open. Sometimes it whispers from behind a veil, changing the course of nations while the world isn't looking. Every rise in history eventually meets its fall. The age of the Valid Sultan, those powerful mothers and grandmothers who once pulled the strings of an empire, was no exception. By the 18th century, the tide of power within the Ottoman world began to shift once again. And with it, the once dominant role of the Valid Sultan slowly faded into the shadows. For nearly 200 years, Valid sultans had been central figures in politics. They were the ones who balanced rival factions, advised their sons, and even acted as regents when child rulers sat on the throne. But as the empire entered a new phase, authority began to return to where tradition always said it belonged: the sultans themselves and their viziers, the high-ranking ministers who served as the empire's executive hands. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was more like a gradual dimming of the light. By the early 1700s, Ottoman rulers grew wary of the influence the harem once wielded. Reforms in governance sought to restore order and centralize power directly in the hands of the throne. The Valid Sultan still held respect and ceremonial prominence. After all, she was the honored mother of the emperor. But her days of signing decrees, arranging political marriages, or deciding the fate of viziers were largely over. Instead, her role shifted to one of ritual and symbolism. She attended major ceremonies. Her name was invoked in prayers, and she retained wealth and dignity. But she was no longer the empire's hidden ruler. The harem, once a nerve center of political strategy, returned to being viewed as a domestic space rather than a parallel court. Yet, even as their direct influence waned, the memory of women like Kösem Sultan and Turhan Sultan lingered. Their legacies refused to disappear. Historians, poets, and travelers continued to whisper about the extraordinary century when women held the fate of an empire in their hands. Think about it. Kösem, signing laws in her own name, commanding soldiers' loyalty through the treasury, or Turhan reshaping Istanbul's skyline with the Yeni Mosque. These were not trivial acts. They were reminders that leadership could come from behind a veil, and that political genius was not bound by gender. So, was the decline of the Valid Sultan's power a sign of progress or regression? On one hand, centralizing authority under the sultans and their viziers seemed like a return to stability. On the other, It erased one of the most fascinating experiments in women's power that the early modern world had ever seen. In Europe, queens like Catherine the Great or Elizabeth I had ruled openly, with crowns upon their heads. But in the Ottoman Empire, women had ruled differently, quietly, strategically, from the shadows. And maybe that's why their memory endures. Because the Valide Sultan represents more than just a historical role, she symbolizes the truth that power can take many forms. Sometimes it's loud, announced with trumpets and armies, and sometimes it's subtle, a whisper that shapes decisions, a signature behind the curtain, a mother's influence over her son. Even in decline, the legend of the Valide Sultans kept echoing. Their palaces, their mosques, their charities all stood as monuments. The people who prayed in those mosques, drank from those fountains, or studied in those schools could still feel their touch. And long after their political influence ended, the empire remembered that, for generations, women had held its fate in their hands. So as we close this chapter, let's ask ourselves, was the Sultanate of Women just an anomaly, a curious footnote in the story of a great empire? Or was it something larger, a glimpse into the hidden ways power moves, even in societies where women were thought to be powerless? One thing is certain, whether celebrated or condemned, their rule left a mark so deep that centuries later, we are still telling their story. And that in itself is a kind of immortality. When we think of empires, we often picture men at the helm, warriors, sultans, and kings carving their names into history. But the story of the Valide Sultan reminds us that power doesn't always wear a crown or sit on a throne. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, moving silently behind curtains of silk, yet shaping the destiny of millions. The Valide Sultan's legacy is not just about palace intrigue or whispered conspiracies. It's about how women found ways to command authority in a deeply patriarchal world. For nearly 3 generations, these women weren't just advisors or mothers. They were kingmakers, regents, and rulers in every sense of the word, except for the title itself. Think about it. Kosum Sultan, signing state decrees as if she were the sovereign. Turhan Sultan, funding massive construction projects that still stand in Istanbul today. Hürrem Sultan, breaking centuries of tradition by marrying Suleiman and transforming the political order of the empire. These weren't side characters in history. They were the ones writing it, and here's why this matters. Too often, history is told as if it belongs only to men. The Ottoman Empire is no exception. Its narrative is usually filled with battles, treaties, and the names of sultans. But the rise of the Valide Sultans challenges that perspective. Their story forces us to ask, how many other moments in history were shaped by women whose influence wasn't recorded, or whose names were deliberately left out? In the Ottoman world, the Valide Sultan was more than just the sultan's mother. She was the empire's hidden sovereign. She didn't need a crown because her power wasn't rooted in ceremony. It was rooted in influence, strategy, and the unshakable bond between mother and son. And in a system where the sultan's authority was absolute, being the one person who could bend his ear meant wielding power greater than any army. But beyond the politics and the intrigue, there's a more universal lesson here. The Valide Sultan shows us that true power doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it works through relationships, persuasion, and resilience. And sometimes, the most powerful person in the room isn't the one sitting on the throne, but the one standing just behind it. So as we close the chapter on the Sultanate of Women, remember this. History isn't just the story of those who ruled openly. It's also the story of those who ruled without recognition, without titles, and without crowns, yet left behind legacies just as enduring. The Valide Sultan was one such figure. More than a mother, more than a royal, she was proof that in the grand drama of empires, even the veiled can hold the sword of destiny. Joan van Nijken bouwen hio an hai tau kak prompt thiuso en kendung.